Hi, our names are Georgia Miller and Katie Sherman, and we'll be presenting on the biomechanics of an overhand lacrosse shot. The first thing we like to talk about are the differences between men's and women's shots. There are a lot of differences in the games, and when we were researching, we found a lot of information on men's kinematics and kinetics and angles, but not so much on women's. The first video we like to show you is of Paul Rabel, and it gives a good overview of the lacrosse shot, but there are some noticeable differences between men's and women's.
To examine the science behind a lacrosse shot, we enlisted one of the game's top players, two-time Major League Lacrosse Offensive Player of the Year, Paul Rabel. He won the Major League Lacrosse fastest shot competition, registering a world record-breaking 111 miles an hour.
111!
And Rabel's shots in a game typically average over 100 miles an hour. For a goaltender, that looks like this. To put this in perspective, from over 60 feet away, a 90-mile-an-hour fastball crosses home plate in less than 44 hundredths of a second. A lacrosse ball fired at 105 miles an hour covers that distance 11% quicker in only 39 hundredths of a second. And shots are often fired from less than 30 feet, shaving the time to react to the ball to under 19 hundredths of a second. The secret to Rabel's blazing shot is a combination of biomechanics and physics. The farther an object is from its axis of rotation, the faster its linear speed. His arm and a 40-inch long stick act as a series of levers, extending the ball as far as 62 inches from the main axis of rotation. Rabel maximizes speeds at the end of the lever with superior biomechanics. As he drives his foot into the turf, friction against the ground allows him to convert his linear momentum into rotational momentum. Rabel conserves this momentum through his hips and torso, rotating his shoulders over 1,300 degrees per second, faster than NHL All-Star Alex Ovechkin rotates on a slap shot.
So this video is not only to show how lacrosse is better than baseball or hockey, but also to give an overview of some of the biomechanics and the kinematics involved in the lacrosse shot. And as I mentioned before, there's some differences between men's and women's shots, but we'll get into that later. Next, here are some of the research findings we found on men's kinematics of the shot. This first graph shows the different phases of a shot. The first, the crankback, then the acceleration phase, and the follow-through. This next graph shows in more detail 5 different phases. First, approach, then crankback, then acceleration, deceleration, and follow-through. And these 2 graphs show how the degrees of rotation change for the pelvis, the trunk, the shoulder, and the elbow during the different phases of the shot cycle. And as you can see, there's a lot of rotation in the pelvis and the trunk. As they showed in the video, Paul Rabel really uses this to create angular momentum. And then this next graph shows more specifically shoulder elevation, rotation, elbow flexion. And these are some of the aspects that we're going to focus more on in the women's game, because these are a lot more involved. Women don't crank back as much, so they have to rely more on their shoulder and elbow momentum to get the power in the shot.
As you can see from the previous video, there's a lot of research on men's, but not enough on women's. We're about to watch these 2 videos of 2 lacrosse shots. We are comparing Georgia Miller. She plays lacrosse here at Ave Maria University. She's no novice at the sport, as she's been playing since 3rd grade. Comparing her shot to Taylor Cummings, who had a stellar career at University of Maryland. Division I lacrosse player, very decorated career. She won the Heisman, of the college lacrosse 3 out of 4 of her years, and she's just a solid player all around. So in Canovia, I analyzed the angle of their left wrist, their left elbow, and their shoulder. Watching these shots over and over in slow motion allowed me to truly spot the differences in their shot, quantitatively and qualitatively. Some big major takeaways to do with the kinematics is that Taylor Cummings, as noticeably has more range of motion in her wrist than Georgia. This is due to her being powerful and having a powerful shot with the snap of the wrist. As you can see that Georgia has a more wider, base, a wider stance. This allows for more, stability, less mobility, and Taylor Cummings is vice versa. And we'll dive into that deeper once we reach the biomechanic principles. So qualitatively, we're going to talk about the hips and the stance, just like I said. Taylor Cummings tends to, move her torso faster, rotates her torso, rotates her hips. And also with the kinetic chain, Taylor Cummings truly, starts from her feet, and then she uses all her momentum with her feet all the way up, all the way to the wrist, unlike Georgia, where her wrist remains, 180 degrees most of the time, whereas Taylor Cummings, flexes to as much as 90 degrees. So here are some time angle graphs. I took the numbers in Canovia and converted them to graphs. I computed 3 graphs, which is the wrist compared to the shot cycle, the elbow to the shot cycle, and the shoulder to the shot cycle. The blue is Taylor Cummings, and the orange is Georgia Miller.
Next, we'd like to talk about the kinetics of a lacrosse shot. This is just the key that shows that the black arrows will be the force of gravity, the red arrows the ground reaction force, and the dot the center of mass. And as you can see, this is Taylor Cummings, different phases, approach, wind up, acceleration, deceleration, and follow through. You can see how her center of mass is staying pretty constant and the force of gravity stays the same. But the thing that's really changing is the ground reaction forces, as you can see on her 2 feet. And throughout the different phases, you see how as she's shifting her weight, those ground reaction forces, their lengths are getting different as there's more weight on her. Originally, in the approach, they're pretty equal, but then in wind up, there's more weight on her back foot. And then you see in acceleration and deceleration, the weight is transferred until it's almost entirely on her front foot. And then compared with me, it's pretty much the same. Ground reaction forces, pretty equal in the beginning. During wind-up, I have all of my weight on my back foot, which is a little bit different from Taylor's. But then you see this similar transfer from the back foot to the front foot. And these kinetics go to show how the ground reaction forces are used to propel the person forward, and that allows more power on the ball. Now we're going to talk about some of the biomechanics principles that are especially relevant for lacrosse. The first one is force time. This means that substantial changes in motion do not occur instantly but are created over time. We saw this in lecture with the example of someone doing a high jump. They start tall and drop down so that they're able to load and create a lot of momentum. And in this way, over a longer period of time, they're creating more force. Otherwise, if they were just to do a high jump just from where they were standing, it would take less time, but they were not able to get as much force. So this is explained by momentum. We saw this momentum with the approach and the wind-up phases in the lacrosse shot. It takes more time to do these things, but it creates a larger impulse for greater speed. And on the opposite side of that, deceleration, in order to manage those great forces that are created, there needs to be a deceleration phase that you saw in the lacrosse shot. And it takes more time to decelerate, and but it is able to manage the forces so that someone doesn't fall over. And especially important for this deceleration are the core, the biceps, the rotator cuff muscles, and other muscles. They all eccentrically contract to decelerate the body over time. The next biomechanics principle is force motion, and this has to do with how unbalanced forces are acting upon the body when we create or modify movement. So you see in this diagram, the person is in equilibrium because the ground reaction forces and the weight are equal. He's not moving. In order to move from this equilibrium, before there is motion, there needs to be changes in force. So you saw this when the person goes to take a step forward. You saw in the kinetics diagram, first there are changes in the ground reaction force, and that has to occur in order for the motion to happen. That ground reaction force on the back leg needs to be used to step forward. I saw this as an example in the lecture of when a punt returner is going left, they have to push off of their right foot. The next two biomechanics principles are very connected. The first is the coordination continuum. Determining optimal timing of muscle actions or segmental motions depends on the force and velocity goals of the movement. So there can be two different types of goals, either high force or high speed. A high force movement requires simultaneous muscle actions. You see this in a deadlift or a squat. All of the muscles are working together at the same time to get to move the barbell. On the other hand, high speed movements such as throwing or kicking require sequential muscle actions. What does this mean? The next biomechanic principle we discuss is segmental interaction. These are how the muscles are working together for the velocity goals of the action. So segmental interaction is forces acting between the segments of a body can transfer energy between segments. So we see this throughout the different phases. First, the ground reaction forces are used. The force is transferred up through the core, through the pelvis, through the trunk, through the shoulders, the elbow, wrist, and finally, with the flick of the wrist, the ball is released. And here is my kinetics diagram to show. You can really see the step is first, and then I begin to rotate my pelvis, and then my trunk, and then my shoulders. And at the very end is when the wrist is used the most. The next principle is balance. Balance is a person's ability to control their body position relative to some base of support. And with a greater base of support comes greater stability. As you can see in my picture, my feet are really wide apart, which means I'm very stable. On the other hand, I have lower mobility. It takes me longer to move from that position. You can see with Taylor Cummings, her feet are much closer together, which means that she has a smaller base of support, lower stability. However, this allows for greater mobility. This comes in handy if for some reason she was to miss her shot and it were to bounce off the post. She is more able to react quickly and retrieve the ball, whereas it might take me longer to move from this wide base of support. Next is optimal projection. For sports and human movements involving projectiles, there is a range of angles that results in best performance. You can see in this video, I am aiming for the top part of the goal. and you can kind of follow the ball to see how it comes off my stick and the track it takes to get into the goal. And here's a diagram I drew following the ball from my stick into the goal. As you can see, it comes off pretty much at the horizon line off of my stick, and it follows this line pretty much just a little bit before the goal, and then with the force of gravity it drops down a little bit so that it's able to hit just right inside the pipes. So the distance from the goal and the type of shot determines the optimal projection of the release point. So if I were farther away, I might need to release the ball sooner so that it followed its projection was a little bit higher. That way it could account for the force of gravity over the time. If I was closer, the opposite. And if it's a different type of shot, that is me aiming for the top. But as you can see in the goal here, another common shot is a bounce shot. So here you aim for the ground. So the release point is a lot longer. It's takes more time in the shot cycle, and I release it a lot lower so that it's able to aim for the ground and bounce in. The last biomechanics principle we'll talk about is range of motion. Less range of motions favors high accuracy, while greater range of motion favors maximum efforts related to force and speed. So the examples we use for this in lecture, less range of motion would be like a dart throw. It takes very high accuracy, but it's only a simple flick of the wrist. While a baseball throw, it has to go a lot farther and faster, so it takes a much greater range of motion and wind up. We already mentioned some of the differences between men's and women's, but it's particularly relevant when considering range of motion. You see here in this picture, this male player is getting a lot of range of motion. He has a huge windup because the men shoot a lot faster, and just because of the rules of their game, they're able to do this more. There's some opportunities for women to shoot like this. This is probably as close as you get. This is Nicole Levy, and she has a great wind-up shot. As you can see, not quite as much range of motion, but she is still getting quite a lot of range of motion. It will take a lot of trunk rotation and torso rotation. However, what is more common in the women's game, just because of the rules and the way we play and our sticks, it usually requires us getting in a lot closer where there's a lot more defenders around us. And so instead of a very high speed shot, it takes a lot more accuracy in close quarters. So this is a lot less range of motion. So you see here, she's on the run. She probably will not have an opportunity to get a lot of range of motion and twist her trunk or even her shoulders. She probably will just have to flick her wrist to get that ball in. So that would be less range of motion but higher accuracy.
So in conclusion, this presentation analyzed the qualitative and quantitative differences between Taylor Cummings and Georgia's shot, especially seen with the kinematics and angle plots. The major differences we want to touch on that Taylor Cummings and Georgia had, difference about their shot was that Taylor had much more wrist flexion, Taylor had a narrower base of support, and Taylor had a greater range of motion with the wrist. Now, with women's lacrosse, there are so many different shots, different sticks, different pockets that affect, the whip of the ball, the optimal projection of the ball. And as we were doing this presentation, we were thinking, which one is better? What shot is better? And if not better, maybe the shots are just different. Maybe all the angle research and the angle numbers aren't because one's better, but one's different. Now, obviously, Taylor Cummings has a lot more experience than Georgia playing the game, and she's at a much more advanced level. But that's not to say Georgia's shot is wrong. they're just different. They have a different type of shot. Not every lacrosse player is the same. So we leave you with this question. Are there different kinds of shots that both work? Or is one just substantially way better than the other? Thank you for listening to this presentation.